What if the most dangerous enemies of Israel were not strangers from distant lands, but people whose stories were deeply connected to Israel's own beginning? What if some of the nations that fought Israel were not just foreign powers, but relatives, neighbors, and descendants of families mentioned in the very first pages of the Bible? That is what makes this story so shocking. When many people think about Israel's ancient enemies, they imagine random hostile nations rising out of nowhere. But the Bible paints a far more dramatic picture. Again and again, Israel's enemies came from old wounds, broken family lines, ancient rivalries, and unfinished acts of rebellion. These were not always enemies from the outside. In many cases, they were tied to Israel's own bloodline, to Abraham's family, to Lot's family, to Isaac's household, and to the painful divisions that shaped the ancient world. This is not just a story about war. It is a story about how sin, jealousy, pride, revenge, and rebellion can turn family into enemies and history into conflict that lasts for generations. To understand the shocking origin of Israel's ancient enemies, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before kings, armies, and famous battles, there was a covenant. God called Abraham and promised to make from him a great nation. That promise would pass through Isaac and then through Jacob, whose name would later be changed to Israel. But from the very beginning, the family line around Abraham was not simple. There were tensions, separations, rival claims, and relationships that would one day grow into full nations. The roots of future conflict were already being planted before Israel even became a nation. That is what makes this story so powerful. The wars of later generations were often connected to choices, divisions, and rivalries that began in the household. One of the most shocking examples is Edom. Edom came from Esau, the brother of Jacob. Think about that for a moment. One of Israel's most famous enemies did not come from a distant tribe unknown to the people of God. Edom came from Jacob's own twin brother. The story begins in the womb. Even before they were born, Jacob and Esau were struggling against each other. That struggle became the symbol of two nations that would one day live in tension. Esau was the older brother, strong, impulsive, a man of the field. Jacob was quieter, more calculating, the one who would later receive the blessing and covenant promise. The conflict between them was not small. Esau lost his birthright. Jacob received the blessing. There was deception, anger, fear, and separation. Even though the brothers would later meet again in a moment that seemed peaceful, the deeper story did not end there. Their descendants became Israel and Edom. What began as tension between brothers grew into hostility between nations. That is why Edom's role in Israel's story feels so tragic. These were people connected by ancestry. They shared roots in the house of Isaac. Yet when Israel was weak, Edom did not act like a brother nation. In some of the darkest moments of Israel's history, Edom stood against Jerusalem rather than beside it. The prophets speak about Edom with sorrow and anger because its betrayal was not merely political. It was personal. It carried the weight of family betrayal. One of Israel's enemies was born from a broken relationship between brothers. Then there are Moab and Ammon, two nations whose origin is just as shocking. Their story goes back to Lot, the nephew of Abraham. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's daughters, living in fear and confusion, committed a disturbing act that resulted in the birth of two sons. Those sons became the fathers of Moab and Ammon. So once again, nations that later opposed Israel did not come from nowhere. Their story was tied to Abraham's wider family circle. Their beginning was marked by shame, confusion, and moral collapse. And in later generations, Moab and Ammon became recurring trouble for Israel. These nations were not always at war with Israel every moment, but they repeatedly appeared as adversaries, tempters, and threats. Moab in particular became associated with spiritual compromise. It was in the plains of Moab that Israel faced seduction, idolatry, and a deadly fall into sin. The danger was not only military. It was spiritual. Moab became a symbol of how enemy nations could weaken Israel not just with swords, but with corruption. Ammon too would become a persistent enemy, resisting Israel and causing conflict in the land. And once again, the shocking part is this: these nations came from the same extended family line connected to Abraham and Lot. They were near in blood, near in geography, and often near in memory. Yet closeness did not produce peace. It often produced bitterness. Another terrifying enemy in Israel's story is Amalek. The Amalekites became one of the most feared names in the Bible because of the way they attacked Israel. Their hostility was ruthless, deliberate, and unforgettable. The first time Israel encountered Amalek after the Exodus, the attack came when the people were vulnerable. This was not honorable warfare. It was predatory aggression against a weary people. That moment left such a mark that Amalek became a symbol of relentless opposition to God's people. But even Amalek has a family connection that makes the story more complex. Amalek is linked in the biblical line to Esau's family. Once again, an enemy of Israel emerges from the wider circle of kinship. The pattern keeps repeating. Israel's enemies often came not from complete strangers, but from those whose roots were intertwined with Israel's own. And this pattern tells us something deep about the Bible's view of human conflict. The greatest dangers do not always come from people who are far away. Sometimes they come from relationships that were meant for peace but became poisoned by jealousy, rivalry, humiliation, and pride. The Bible does not hide this truth. It shows that family lines can carry blessing, but they can also carry wounds. Unresolved conflict can outlive the people who started it. A betrayal in one generation can become a war in another. Now consider the Philistines, perhaps the most famous of Israel's ancient enemies. The Philistines are different from Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Amalek because they were not portrayed as close family relatives in the same way. Yet they became one of Israel's greatest and most memorable enemies. When most people think of Israel's ancient battles, they think of the Philistines. They think of Samson. They think of Saul. They think of David and Goliath. The Philistines were powerful, organized, aggressive, and deeply threatening to Israel's survival during the period of the Judges and the early monarchy. What made the Philistines dangerous was not only their military strength, but their constant presence. They were not a distant empire that attacked once and disappeared. They were a nearby enemy pressing Israel repeatedly, humiliating them, occupying territory, and challenging their identity. They represented the pressure of living beside a people who did not serve the God of Israel and who repeatedly sought to dominate them. The Philistines were not tied to Israel through the same family drama as Edom or Moab, but they became a lasting enemy because they stood in direct opposition to Israel's calling, stability, and future in the land. Then the story widens even more. As Israel grew from tribes into a kingdom, the enemies became larger. No longer was the danger only from neighboring nations with shared ancestry or border disputes. Now the great empires began to rise. Assyria and Babylon entered the picture. These powers were different. They were massive, organized, terrifying, and capable of crushing whole nations. When Assyria came, it was like a storm swallowing everything in its path. When Babylon rose, it did not merely threaten Israel. It shattered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried the people into exile. At first glance, these empires seem very different from the family-based enemies like Edom or Moab. But even here, the Bible teaches the same deeper lesson. Israel's greatest dangers were never only about politics or military strength. They were also tied to spiritual reality. Again and again, the biblical writers show that external enemies rise when internal faithfulness collapses. In other words, the story is not just about who hated Israel. It is also about why Israel became vulnerable. Foreign enemies often became instruments of judgment in moments when the nation abandoned the covenant. This does not excuse the cruelty of those empires, but it shows that in the biblical story, enemy nations are not random pieces on a map. They appear within a larger moral and spiritual drama. That is one reason this subject is so compelling. The shocking origin of Israel's enemies is not just about bloodlines. It is also about the human heart. Why did brother fight brother? Why did neighboring nations become bitter enemies? Why did people with shared ancestors grow into rival kingdoms? Because the same forces that destroy families today were at work then: envy, fear, greed, wounded pride, and the desire to possess what God gave to another. The story of Israel's enemies is a mirror showing what happens when sin hardens into identity. A conflict may begin with one insult, one deception, one act of betrayal, one lust for power, and then over time it becomes tradition, memory, national pride, and permanent hostility. Think again about Esau and Jacob. A stolen blessing became more than a family dispute. It became the shadow hanging over two nations. Think about Lot's descendants in Moab and Ammon. A sinful beginning became part of a painful national story. Think about Amalek. An attack on the weak became a lasting symbol of hatred. Think about the Philistines. Constant pressure from a hostile neighbor shaped some of Israel's most dramatic moments. In every case, the enemy is not just an enemy. The enemy has a story. And the origin of that story is often far more personal, painful, and morally complicated than people realize. This is why the Bible's account of Israel's enemies feels different from ordinary history. It does not only say who fought whom. It asks deeper questions. Where did this hostility begin? What ancient wound gave birth to this conflict? What spiritual failure allowed this enemy to rise? The Bible is not content to describe battles. It wants us to understand roots. And when we look at the roots, we see something shocking. Many of Israel's enemies were born from family fractures, moral failure, and long memories of resentment. There is also an important warning here. The enemies of Israel were not always stronger because they were better. Often they seemed to gain ground when Israel itself forgot who it was. The danger became greatest when the people of God lost their spiritual clarity, adopted the practices of the nations around them, or trusted human strength more than divine guidance. In those moments, enemies that had always existed became overwhelming. The issue was not only the enemy outside the gate. It was the condition of the heart inside the nation. That pattern repeats across Scripture. And it gives this story meaning far beyond ancient history. Because when you really think about it, the story of Israel's enemies is also the story of humanity. How many conflicts in this world began between people who were once close? How many wars, divisions, and hatreds began with family, shared history, or broken trust? How many people who should have lived in peace became lifelong opponents because pride would not let the wound heal? The Bible shows us that this is not a new problem. Ancient enemies often come from ancient relationships. And that is what makes them so dangerous. Strangers may oppose you, but betrayal from those who are near cuts deeper. The tragedy is that Israel's history contains both kinds of enemies. There were enemies from outside, like the great empires, and enemies from nearby, like the Philistines. But some of the most emotionally charged conflicts came from those who were closest in origin. Edom was not just another nation. Edom was Esau. Moab and Ammon were not just neighboring states. They came from Lot's family. Amalek's line was bound into Israel's larger ancestral world. These stories remind us that nearness does not guarantee loyalty. Shared beginnings do not guarantee shared destiny. And yet, even within this dark history, the Bible also leaves room for something remarkable. It shows that God remains sovereign over the whole story. Human rivalry may shape nations, but it does not cancel divine purpose. Enemy nations rise and fall, but God's covenant purposes continue. Israel faced enemies on every side, from family-born rivals to vast imperial powers, and yet the biblical story keeps moving forward. Again and again, God preserves a remnant, raises leaders, sends prophets, gives warnings, and keeps his promises alive even in the middle of conflict. That is why the story of Israel's enemies is not ultimately a story of defeat. It is a story of struggle, discipline, survival, and divine faithfulness in a hostile world. Still, the shocking origin of these enemies should make us pause. It should make us see that the Bible is not a flat story of good people versus bad people. It is a painfully realistic story about what happens when families break, when sin is left unchecked, when envy grows, and when generations inherit grudges instead of peace. Israel's enemies were not merely random villains entering the stage. Many of them were the outcome of earlier choices, earlier divisions, and earlier acts of rebellion. The battlefield was prepared long before the armies arrived. So when you read about Israel fighting Edom, you are also hearing the echo of Jacob and Esau. When you read about Moab and Ammon, you are hearing the echo of Lot's tragic story. When you read about Amalek, you are seeing how cruelty can become a legacy. When you read about the Philistines, you are seeing what happens when a hostile culture keeps pressing against God's people. And when you read about Assyria and Babylon, you are seeing how unchecked national sin can open the door to devastating judgment. Every enemy has an origin. Every conflict has a root. And the roots are often darker and closer than we expect. That is why the origin of Israel's ancient enemies is so shocking. It is not just shocking because these enemies were fierce. It is shocking because many of them were connected to Israel's own story from the beginning. They were not always distant invaders. They were often the result of fractured relationships, compromised morals, inherited rivalries, and spiritual failure. The Bible reveals that history is not only shaped by armies and kings. It is shaped by families, choices, and the condition of the heart. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of all. The greatest threats are not always born in faraway places. Sometimes they are born in moments of jealousy, deception, compromise, and pride. Sometimes they grow in silence over generations until they become impossible to ignore. Sometimes yesterday's family wound becomes tomorrow's national crisis. Israel's enemies teach us that sin never stays small, and brokenness never stays contained. What begins in one house can shake a nation. So the next time you hear the names Edom, Moab, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia, Assyria, or Babylon, do not think only of battlefields and swords. Think of beginnings. Think of brothers divided. Think of families fractured. Think of covenant ignored. Think of sin growing roots. Because the shocking truth is that Israel's ancient enemies were often much closer than anyone imagined. And that is what makes this story so unforgettable. It is not just ancient history. It is a warning. It is a revelation. And it is a reminder that when people turn from truth, when wounds are nursed instead of healed, and when pride is chosen over obedience, enemies are born. If this story opened your eyes, let me know in the comments which enemy shocked you the most. Was it Edom, the nation born from a brother's rivalry? Was it Moab and Ammon, born from one of the Bible's darkest family moments? Was it Amalek, remembered for ruthless hatred? Or was it the Philistines and the great empires that nearly crushed Israel altogether? And if you want more Bible mysteries, ancient history, and powerful stories hidden in Scripture, make sure you subscribe and stay with us for the next video.